The Murder Shelf Book Club contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
I sat in my truck almost paralyzed by the implication of that call. 10 years after her mumbling, dazed, and highly questionable testimony had helped seal Jessie's fate, she was willing to recant. Her testimony was part of the charade contrived by the police and prosecutor to successfully build up the satanic angle. It was the only evidence that they produced that even came close to corroborating Jessie's ridiculous confession. Now, 10 years later, her admission that her trial testimony was false was both exhilarating and frustrating. It provided a slim ray of hope. Dan Stidham, A Harvest of Innocence, the Untold Story of the West Memphis Three Murder Case, by Dan Stidham and Tom McCarthy. Well, welcome to the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast. I am your host, Jill. After a number of requests for a book on this case, here we are. This is episode 104, Paradise Imperfect, Part 3, 2ndCast, A Harvest of Innocence, the Untold Story of the West Memphis Three Murder Case, by Dan Stidham and Tom McCarthy. If you haven't listened to the first two parts, I think you should. This book chronicles defense attorney Dan Stidham's journey through the West Memphis Three case. There was so much I had not heard before. Now, we left Dan Stidham, who is now both Jessie Misskelley and Jason Baldwin's attorney, filing appeals on their behalf that they had received ineffective counsel and that Jessie Misskelley had not been properly apprised of his rights to remain silent by the West Memphis Police as required in Rule 2.3. Dan was hopeful, having gained insight from world-renowned forensic pathologists such as Dr. Michael Baden. There was hope of getting this thing overturned. The release of HBO's first Paradise Lost film had begun to change public opinion. And this continued in 2000 when the second documentary, Paradise Lost Revelations, premiered and was now attracting persons of influence like Eddie Vedder of the musical group Pearl Jam. Vedder reached out to international human rights and criminal defense attorney John Phillipsborn, asking him to review the case. And soon, Phillipsborn would take on the role of architect for Jessie and Jason's cases, having vast experience in the appellate court, capital punishment, and had written amicus briefs for cases argued before the Supreme Court of the United States, federal, and state courts. As the films resonated, churning up more interest, more became shocked at the level of injustice. And even the final holdouts in Dan's hometown of Paragould seemed to have seen the light. Dan was asked to run for Greene County Municipal Court Judge, a part-time position so that would enable him to continue working for Jessie and Jason. And on May 23, 2000, Dan was elected judge by a 60 to 40% margin. Good for Dan. And good for the people of Greene County. They got a good judge. April 2000, Dan met with Eddie Vedder, John Phillipsborn, Damien's lawyer, Ed Mallett, and Lori Davis, now Damien's wife. Michael Burt, a DNA expert with vast experience in death penalty cases and is specializing in forensic science issues, attended. Warm, supportive, they hashed out how to help move the case forward, with Vedder telling his publicist to, quote, give them what they need to get this done, end quote. When When she pushed back, they were already committed to the homeless and saving the whales. He said, quote, "It's only money. We'll make more," end quote. Not bragging, but speaking from the heart. And his role in this is pivotal, and I respect it. With support growing, Dan filed 2 motions to preserve evidence and access evidence for testing and the amended pro se Rule 37 petitions for Jessie and Jason. On Valentine's Day 2001, victim Stevie Branch's mom, Pam Hobbs, emailed Dan writing of her heartbreak over her son's death. She wanted to meet and discuss the case, and Dan writes, quote, "In small steps, she would soon become an important ally," end quote. Another supporter that emerged was a determined investigative journalist from Arkansas, Mara Leverett. Her book, Devil's Knot, was published in 2002 and also had a huge positive impact on public perception. FYI, Mara Leverett was just about the only journalist from Arkansas to write anything at all. Okay, a true woman of integrity. Now, fun fact, made into a film by the same name, Michael Gladys played Dan Stidham. Reaching out to Dan to get a feel for his character, Dan and Gladys hit it off, and Dan would give him the very glasses that he wore during Jessie's trial. Now that is pretty cool. In 2002, with the appeals finally moving forward, Dan's role would shift. Experienced appellate attorneys, John Phillipsborn was representing Jason Baldwin, and Michael Burt, representing Jessie, would take the lead. Each of them had the support of other well-known Arkansas attorneys, Jeff Rosenzweig on Team Jessie and Blake Hendricks on Team Jason. Explaining to Jessie that Michael and Jeff were now his attorneys was difficult for Dan, as he knew Jessie would be thinking he'd been abandoned. But these new lawyers were the best thing to ever happen to Jessie, and Dan assured him that he would still be working to get him out of prison, which is still 9 long years away. July 26, 2003, the Paragould Daily Press did a front-page feature on Dan and the West Memphis Three case. Dan was in the spotlight. He recited the many irregularities and steamrolling tactics used by the police, and this triggered Judge David Burnett, who wrote a complaint to James A. Baldwin, head of the Arkansas Judicial Discipline and Disability Commission, saying that Dan Stidham had violated the canon of ethics. Oh my God, the pot calling the kettle black. Are you kidding me? The audacity of this guy. Now, in psychology, this is called projection. It's a defense mechanism. When you project undesirable feelings or emotions onto someone else rather than seeing them in oneself. And the only reason Dan discovered this at all was because a carbon copy of Burnett's letter to the commission was included with a letter informing Dan the complaint was dismissed. And now Judge David Burnett continued his vendetta against Dan, looking for an opponent to unseat Dan in the next judicial election. Only Burnett failed miserably. As all this was going down, Pam Hobbs shared some news about DNA with Dan. A hair that was found in the ligature that bound Michael Moore did not match Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, or Jessie Misskelley. And this mitochondrial DNA less than conclusively matched that of Terry Hobbs. And Hobbs had said he was not surprised by this at all because the boys had played in his house. But what came out was that 3 neighbors revealed that they had seen Terry Hobbs with Michael, Christopher, and Stephen that night, which Hobbs adamantly denies. And of this, Dan writes, quote, "One thing is certain, there is more evidence pointing to him than there ever was against the West Memphis Three," end quote. Pam Hobbs would divorce Terry Hobbs. Once the voice of the grief-stricken, angry parent, her hatred for the West Memphis Three was palatable. Now, Pam joined John Mark Byers in becoming advocates for the defendants, his opinion changing 180 degrees as well. By 2003, Pam no longer trusted the West Memphis police nor prosecutor Brent Davis. The catalyst for part of this transformation was her son Stevie's pocket knife, a gift from his grandpa, one he carried faithfully. Without question, Stevie would have had this pocket knife with him the day he died. Well, after a violent argument with Terry, Pam and her sister, Jo Lynn, took Terry's strongbox with them as they fled the Hobbs house. Prying it open, Pam found Stevie's pocket knife inside. How had Terry gotten Stevie's knife? Why was it hidden away in the strongbox? Fear shot through Pam. Was this tied to the night of May 5th, 1993? In a deposition, Pam would state that she believed, quote, that Stevie had it with him when he died. Stevie loved that knife. I had been shocked that the police did not find it with Stevie when they found his body. I had always assumed that my son's murderer had taken the knife during the crime. I couldn't believe it was in Terry's things. He never told me he had it, end quote. This argument also reminded Pam of how irrational and violent Terry could be. A memorandum on this was sent to Phillipsborn and Burt, and if nothing else, this was important because a victim's parent had reached out and no longer had faith in the prosecution's case. In March 2004, Dan's telephone rang, and it was a Fayetteville attorney. He had prosecution witness Victoria Hutchison in his office. After a decade, the woman's guilty conscience had finally gotten to her, and she was prepared to recant her testimony in the Misskelley trial. Surprised, Dan knew that Vicky had committed perjury, and this meant that there was another sliver of hope. But would she recant under oath? No, she wasn't ready to do that. But still, Dan needed to hear what she had to say. Lifting heaven and earth to get to that office by the next day, Dan had also researched perjury and concluded that Vicky Hutchison could not be arrested as the statute of limitations had expired. Sitting with Vicky and her lawyer, Dan flipped on a camera and recorder and placed Vicky under oath. And what she said next was golden. Every word of her testimony in 1994 was a lie. She confessed to having been high on Valium and morphine. Prosecutor Brent Davis actually checked to see that she had enough drugs to testify. Vicky had been frightened to death by the West Memphis Police Department and feared losing custody of her child. And her story of coercion fit the prosecution's pattern of behavior that was emerging. The West Memphis Police had taken her and her son across state lines so that neither could be subpoenaed by defense attorneys. They paid for their hotel room and food for the entire second trial, moving them once they feared that private investigator Ron Lax was closing in. Vicky was only allowed to come back after Damien and Jason's conviction and sentencing. As Vicky spoke, she sobbed. Clearly, the burden of this deception had weighed on her. Now, this made Dan recall a phone conversation he had back in 1998 with Joyce Curitin, the head matron of the Craig's Head County Juvenile Detention Facility. She knew that Jason Baldwin was innocent. She had been ordered by the sheriff of Craig's Head County to leave town to avoid being subpoenaed too. And in the 2012 film, West of Memphis, Joyce Curitin states that the sheriff told her, quote, "Joyce, Crittenden County fucked up and now we have to clean up," end quote. At the time, Joyce had been fearful of losing her job, so she hid out in Jackson County, Arkansas, with a county car and a county credit card, coming home only after the Echols and Baldwin trials had concluded. And who directed the sheriff to do that? who benefited by getting Joyce out of the way. And while I wanted Dan to march in and play this recording and just poof, get the three of them right out of prison, that is not how this works. And we really need some serious reforms here. That's my conclusion after all of this. You have to call your representatives murder bookies. Remember, they work for us. Well, Vicky's story was a huge break in the case. This new evidence would add towards the cumulative effect that would deconstruct the prosecution's entire case. And Dan called Phillips Bourne and Burt, filling them in. Gratified, John Phillips Bourne gently reminded Dan that he wasn't the attorney of record anymore, and perhaps he should have let an investigator go and take the statement. Oh my God, right. This hadn't even blipped on Dan's radar. But Hutchison had wanted to speak to Dan specifically by name, so it was really important to get this statement before something changed her mind. But Dan had to remember which role he was playing these days. Slowly, another critical part of the defense began to gather support, and that is the science and understanding of false confession. Now, in 2024, this concept is universally accepted, and it's possible to identify where it occurs, avoiding injustice, or at least we hope so. But Dan laments that some still do not believe that anyone would confess to doing something that they didn't do. Now, these are the superhumans who can withstand the rigors of brutal police interrogations with their mind shields and magical items to protect them, plus rolling a crit on a D20 dice. Please note my sarcasm. This kind of immunity, that it won't happen to me, is a fantasy. We are all susceptible to this kind of pressure, so it needs to be avoided. Now, research demonstrates that false confession is caused most commonly by the use of intimidation, force, coercive tactics, isolation during interrogations, and deceptive methods that include lying about evidence. For example, what Jessie was told, quote, "You failed the polygraph, you're lying through your teeth," end quote. After 4 to 6 hours of intense interrogation, even people of higher than normal IQ will break down. Even military personnel trained to withstand the psychological stressors. Note this, the longer the interrogation, the less validity it has. That is key. According to the Innocence Project, 375 people have been exonerated since 1989 using DNA testing, and this includes 21 on death row. Of these 375, 1/3 had given false confessions. Dan goes into great detail on how Jessie Misskelley came to give the false confession, but it's not hard to imagine, given who this 17-year-old cognitively challenged teenager was. 12 hours of interrogation in 2 sessions, recording only 46 minutes total. This should have been the red owls of red mountains and red flags to anybody looking into this. Voluntary false confession can be the result of a mental disorder, occurring when innocent people confess to police because they're seeking attention and fame. John Mark Carr in the John Benet Ramsey case is an example. Carr confessed to the murder, he was arrested, and then was proven to have not killed the 6-year-old beauty queen. Sometimes people falsely confess to protect others. The second kind is called persuaded false confession. This occurs when a suspect starts doubting their own memory. After police scrutiny, they become temporarily influenced to believe it's more likely than not that they committed the crime, even though they have no memory of committing it. Speaking to the Saline Courtier, Dan told them, quote, "These are people who are actually convinced by their interrogators that they actually committed a crime when they didn't," end quote. The third category of false confession occurs when interrogators psychologically coerce a subject to confess, and they do this to end the stress and the anxiety of police confession. Or they believe if they confess, they'll be released or given a lesser punishment. These are called compliant because police attempt to get a suspect to agree that they committed the crime. So of these three, which one do you think Jessie Misskelley's confession comes under? Seeking fame and attention, persuaded false confession, or compliant false confession? Do, 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 do. Okay, enough of that. Jessie is an example of false compliant confession. All right, to avoid false confessions, we need reforms. Interrogations must be videotaped, or at minimum, recorded. Juveniles and intellectually disabled people should not be lied to by the police. They cannot process this disinformation properly. And third, we need to stop creating the environment that triggers false confessions in the first place. False confession does nothing to solve cases, and it doesn't put bad guys behind bars and protect society. It does just the opposite. So let's just not go there and waste all the resources. In 2004, Dan had Jessie tested by a leading forensic psychologist, Dr. Tim Durning, and he learned that 95 to 98% of the people Jessie encountered in his life were intellectually superior to him. Now, we're not saying this to be mean or to demean Jessie, because Dan has true affection and caring for him. But this is an accurate assessment of Jessie's reality. Jessie had developed various coping strategies where he would attempt to please those around him, or in this case, mask his cognitive deficits. He'd pretend to understand more than he did, agreeing with what he was told, which provided a sense of him fitting in. And this made him even more vulnerable to the West Memphis Police Department pressure. And both West Memphis Police Department Inspector Gary Gitchell and Officer Bryn Ridge admitted knowing that Jessie was mentally challenged. Then the earthquake came. Dr. Durning's conclusion would have uprooted the 1994 trial completely. He determined that Jessie Misskelley was not competent to stand trial in 1994. He did not adequately understand the criminal procedures, and he was not able to assist in his own defense as a result. Remember, I had told you how mind-boggled Dan and Greg Crow were, trying to eke out any consistency or a narrative from Jessie in telling what happened because he was incapable of providing it. He hadn't committed the crime. 10 years into Jessie's prison sentence, Durning recognized that Jessie didn't understand the concept of a defense attorney, a judge, prosecutor, or a jury trial. He certainly did not understand waiving his Miranda rights. Now, for the vast majority of inmates, the longer they are enmeshed in the legal system, the more knowledge they acquire of how it works, of what your constitutional rights are, how criminal procedures process. This knowledge all increases. This did not happen with Jessie Misskelley. His understanding of his situation never became any more sophisticated. Now, in 2012, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in the case of Miller versus Alabama that, quote, mandatory life without parole for those under the age of 18 at the time of their crimes violates the Eighth Amendment, end quote, as juveniles cannot fully appreciate the risks and consequences because they lack the cognitive ability to understand. In 2014, another ruling came down that state courts must consider more than raw IQ scores in determining if someone is mentally challenged. Anyone who fits this definition should not face the death penalty, which was exactly what Dan argued before Judge David Burnett in 1994, with Burnett claiming that Jessie Misskelley had street smarts, which further exposed his judicial bias. Just common sense, Dan knew that using more than IQ score was necessary. It just took the legal system 2 decades to catch up to him. And now, 14 years later, it was finally time for Jessie's Rule 37 hearing, where Judge David Burnett, yes, same judge, would determine Dan's effectiveness in the Misskelley trial of 1994. 14 years is just inexcusable. A gag order was issued as Judge Burnett also chose the smallest courtroom to hold the hearing, effectively eliminating space for a crush of media. Interesting tactic. Now, the time leading up to this Rule 37 hearing was tough for Dan. His marriage had finally given up the fight as he and Kim divorced. It was rough on the kids, especially the youngest, Catherine, who is now a 15-year-old. She had never known a time without the West Memphis Three in her life. September 30th, 2008, the Rule 37 hearing had begun in the small Craigshead County courtroom in Jonesboro. Defense attorneys Michael Burt and Jeff Rosenzweig were there representing Jessie, who was wearing a spiffy new suit. John Phillipsborn and Blake Hendricks were also present with Jason Baldwin. Brent Davis was also there. Dan was sworn in. His testimony would be focusing on 2 critical issues. First, his lack of experience as a young lawyer, and the Rule 2.3, memorialized in the 1996 Arkansas Supreme Court ruling. Dan readily admitted that his defense of Jessie was substandard, which kind of felt like eating glass. Yeah, it's hard to do. It really is. Michael Burt had Dan explain Judge Burnett's bizarre intrusion into the jury room during their second day of deliberations under the pretense of ordering food. When the foreman said food wasn't necessary because they were finishing up, the judge admonished him. They needed to eat because they'd have to stay for sentencing. If you remember, the foreman replied, quote, "What if we find him not guilty? Will we still have to stay?" End quote. As gasps in the courtroom erupted. Later, a TV reporter found Judge Burnett asking if what Dan Stidham stated under oath was accurate, and he shrugged, saying, quote, "It could have taken place, I guess, but I don't really recall." End quote. Cowardly liar, man. Well, now a debate erupted on whether any of the forensic experts for the defense would be allowed to testify. Burnett is pulling this crap again. Burnett was concerned that the record was going to be so voluminous, it would take the Arkansas Supreme Court 10 years to read it. Oh my God. So once again, he already knows what his ruling is going to be and that the appeal is coming. How did this guy get reelected? Arkansas, please, someone explain this to me. I just don't understand. Well, all 4 defense attorneys argued that all of this forensic evidence was relevant and proper. Brent Davis thought that the, quote, far-reaching scientific evidence stuff should not be something that should come into a Rule 37 hearing, end quote. He was rightly fearful that this new science-y stuff would prove devastating to the prosecution's case. 6 weeks later came day 2 of testimony. Brent Davis's cross-examination put into the record why he believed that Jessie, Damien, and Jason were guilty of the first ever and only satanic ritualistic homicide recorded, which included transcripts, testimony, Jessie's confession. All of these were now on the record. The next day, Dan began answering questions about his efforts on Jessie's behalf, now almost 15 years ago. And by the way, Judge Burnett was retiring on January 1st, 2009, with Brent Davis poised to take his place on the bench. Burnett hoped that they'd finish up by December 31st. But if not, no biggie. And Dan turned green. Clearly, Burnett would not be ending his involvement with the West Memphis Three case at the end of the year. Oh, God. April and November 2009. Back testifying. Dan half expected Judge Burnett to proclaim him the most amazing, competent attorney ever, an actual child prodigy, and certainly not ineffective. Well, he didn't exactly do that, but I get it. Dr. Tim Durning continued testifying that Jessie was not competent to stand trial in 1994, and all of his confessions at the police station, in the police car, the Bible confession, were all the result of his incapacity to comprehend the implications of what was happening. The trial psychologist's conclusions were wrong on every count, especially in finding him competent to stand trial, which magnified Dan's ineffective counsel errors in failing to retain a competent psychologist. Now, predictably, Judge Burnett inserted himself into the proceedings, and he asked Dr. Durning about Jessie's street smarts. Had they been taken into consideration? And now I'm going to be paraphrasing. Dr. Durning responded with an unequivocal no. Examining Jessie's daily life, level of functioning, what people say about him, what he is able to do, all must be taken into consideration in addition to IQ score. For example, quote, Durning asked Jessie, if you plead guilty, can you still try to convince the judge that you're innocent? Well, yes, I guess you can, end quote, Jessie responded. Yeah, he has no idea what even a guilty plea means. Durning explained that Jessie pretended to know when he did not. Jessie would listen and try to figure out what you wanted to hear, never understanding the implications, and thus was unable to help in his own defense. Brent Davis asked Durning about the Bible confession. Hadn't Jessie confessed with no law enforcement present at all? And Durning said in this instance, he heard Jessie doing the same thing, while Mr. Stidham struggled to word questions correctly, hoping Jessie understood, with Jessie not responding. So this was a lead balloon and not what the prosecution wanted to hear. Now Judge Burnett interfered again, asking Durning, how is it possible for Jessie, with these limitations, to come up with a confession story? Durning replied that Jessie's, quote, story was not convincing and doesn't hold together in the long run. His story provided no corroborating information, and I didn't find anything different at the end of the day, end quote. Burt now asked if Jessie had any conception of what a Rule 37 hearing was about. No, he did not. It was Davis's turn to ask if Jessie's statement to Mr. Stidham was an attempt to get himself out of trouble, and if so, wasn't mental functioning necessary to do that? Well, never ask a question that you don't know the answer to, Mr. Prosecutor. Dr. Durning's reply was devastating. He said that had Jessie understood the serious nature of his predicament, he'd have wanted to cut a deal. Jessie would have provided the prosecution with a consistent confession and story. Jessie did none of those. Further, Prosecutor Davis was lucky, quote, he didn't have him testify in those trials. Frankly, that was probably very smart, because I think he just could not hold it together and give a cohesive story that would have assisted you, end quote. Stunning Davis. And this is when it happened on the record. Davis is going to say something, so listen. Davis replies, quote, okay, you understand that a prosecutor can't meet, discuss, and go over testimony with the defendant to see what his story is and what he's capable of as far as relating the facts to the jury, right? End quote. Oh my God. That is exactly what Davis had done with Jessie 15 years before. Do you remember that? Over Dan's repeated, strong objections, he had met with Jessie behind Dan's back to, quote, discuss and go over Misskelley's anticipated testimony at the Echols-Baldwin trial with Judge David Burnett's approval, end quote. Well, back in court on August 10th, 2019, Rosenzweig and Phillipsborn again asked Judge Burnett to recuse himself due to his Arkansas Senate campaign being in full throttle. Burnett refused, a clear ethical violation on his part, and one he was allowed to get away with. As a witness himself, Dan had not been allowed to listen to other defense witnesses testifying. So he had to resort to reading the 2,900 pages of transcripts, which is tedious at best. But it was worthwhile, as the revelations that evaporated the state's case were in there, although all of this would be obscured by the Alford Pleas. 4 of the world's best forensic pathologists would testify on the sciencey stuff, all agreeing that the injuries to the 3 victims were caused largely by animal predation, specifically Christopher Byers' genital injuries. He had not been castrated by Satan-loving crazies. Dr. Werner Spitzer refuted Jessie's claim that fists and sticks had been used on the boys. Had Dr. Spitzer seen indications of knife wounds on the children? No, none. Dr. Michael Batten testified next, agreeing with Dr. Spitzer on the animal predation. He also stated, quote, the testimony about cults, particularly what was testified to as the cutting off of the penis and scrotum by a human, was just wrong, end quote. Dr. Richard Severin, the forensic odontologist, testified that the wounds on the boys were likely due to turtles, not teeth, and he was positive that they were not made by a knife. Further, he eliminated the knife found behind the Baldwin trailer as the source of the marks. The final defense pathologist was Dr. Janice Offavin, specializing in pediatric forensic pathology. She was emphatic that the genitals of Christopher Byers were not removed with a knife, and this testimony demolished the state's case. The state wanted to call their own forensic pathologist to rebut them, but no forensic pathologist would testify that Arkansas pathologist Frank Peretti's findings were correct. None. Boom. Hunting. The state insisted that there was no aquatic or animal life in the watery trench in the middle of the woods where the boys were found, which is ridiculous. West Memphis police officers Mike Allen and Bryn Ridge were called to the stand. They were crushed on the cross-examination. The defense called John Mark Byers, who testified that his stepson Christopher would often bring turtles home after visiting Robin Hood Hills. And then came Dr. Peretti to the stand. Since he raised turtles, he knew the marks on the boys were not turtle bites, nor were they animal predation at all. All of the other world-class pathologists were wrong. Okay. Under the defense's questioning, Peretti became defensive and irritated. Had animal hairs been found on the boys? Yes, they had. Hadn't the West Memphis Police Department misinterpreted his report, believing the victims had been sexually abused when they had not? Peretti said he didn't know what he could have done to correct the prosecution's misimpression. And then he said it. This is another huge moment here. Quote, prosecutors can make you testify to things. You know what I'm saying? Peretti insinuated that he adjusted his testimony in the Echols-Baldwin trial at the request of the prosecution. end quote. Why can't they just admit that they were wrong, caught up in the hysteria, and desperate to solve the case and correct this? No, better to put 3 innocents in prison and on death row. Well, then retired FBI profiler Ken Lanning came to the stand. Satanic ritualistic homicide did not exist. Lanning had conducted a huge research study in the late 80s, and he found no support for this. The man couldn't document a single case, and this scientific conclusion was replicated in the UK as well. Boom! Filmmakers Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh had retained the man who invented criminal profiling, John Douglas. John Douglas also wrote Law and Disorder, the legendary FBI profiler's relentless pursuit of justice, with a number of chapters dedicated to this case. And guess what? I have studied this book cover to cover. In 1993, then Unit Chief Douglas had no recollection of the West Memphis Police Department reaching out for assistance. But evidently, they had talked to 2 agents about the kinds of questions to ask when they did door-to-door canvassing, end quote. There was no record of any follow-up at the time, end quote. John Douglas also wrote of his interactions with Ken Lanning. Ken had advised the police in the John Benet Ramsey case, with Boulder Police Department not liking his suggestions, and Lanning had then been shut out, which is not surprising to me. And please check out my episodes on John Benet, episodes 37, 38, 39, and the next, my special interview with author Paula Woodward. Anyway, Ken Lanning spoke with the West Memphis Three prosecution about their pursuit of a satanic murderer. Lanning told Douglas, quote, "I said I thought they were letting the theory drive the investigation," end quote. And he also said if they brought a satanic murder theory to trial, they'd be laughed out of the court. And Lanning never heard back from them either. Now, Douglas has the greatest respect for Ken Lanning and never, ever discounted anything he had to say about a case. But the only thing that Ken was wrong about is the prosecution was not laughed out of court, bringing in a satanic murder theory. And this is, quote, "precisely where the tragedy of murder was compounded with the tragedy of a miscarriage of justice," end quote.
Yeah.
August 18th, 2011. Dan's phone rang, and it was the newly elected prosecutor, Scott Ellington, who announced, quote, "Your boy is getting out tomorrow," end quote, referring to Jessie Misskelley. Dan was told he was taking an Alford Plea, and Dan should be in Craigshead County Circuit Court by 9:30 a.m.
Whoa.
Dan was thunderclapped. He called John Phillipsborn, who confirmed, yes, it's happening. By now, Dan was engaged to Leah Ann, and she was ecstatic. And Dan called ex-wife Kim, who congratulated him for finally getting Jessie out of prison. He had kept his promise. But Dan didn't know how this came about. Well, I happen to think that the critical factor was that Judge David Burnett had finally given up the case when he was elected to the Arkansas Senate. Oh, these poor people. Now, on November 4th, 2010, the Arkansas Supreme Court reversed Burnett's 2008 ruling, denying the motions for a new trial for Damien Echols, Jessie Misskelley, and Jason Baldwin. The state Supreme Court remanded the case back to the circuit courts, ordering evidentiary hearings to review the new evidence. Judge David Lasser would preside, and he scheduled it to begin in December 2011. But behind the scenes, more shenanigans were afoot. Buzzing and still confused, Dan arrived in court early with Leah Ann. Dan spoke with Jeff Rosenzweig, who told him that they would have gotten a new trial simply based on Burnett's refusal to recuse himself from the case after he announced his candidacy for the Senate. Everyone seemed in agreement that the Rule 37 hearing had obliterated the state's case. Well, so how did they get to an Alford plea? Hold on, we'll get there. In the courtroom, Damien, Jessie, and Jason were almost catatonic, pressed up against the eastern wall, in handcuffs and shackled to each other, likely not believing that this was real. Dan told them he was thrilled they were getting out, but that the state was taking the coward's way out. Shaking hands, Damien's were ice cold. Dan writes, quote, "I do not believe I had ever seen anyone so pale who was still alive. He was so fragile looking that I really hoped he would survive long enough to walk off Arkansas's famous death row in the minutes ahead," end quote. Jason was uncertain. Quote, "Dan, am I doing the right thing?" End quote, with Dan assuring him he was. But Dan would feel guilty when he learned that Jason had been the holdout in taking the Alford plea. Dan saw Eddie Vedder and the Dixie Chicks, Natalie Maines, now the Chicks, in court that day. Dan spoke with John Mark Byers, who shook his hand as Mark passionately whispered, quote, "Promise me that you'll find the real killer. We both know who it is," end quote. Pam Hobbs was there as well, and they hugged, and she too extracted the same promise from Dan. The hearing was short, running on autopilot. Judge Lasser vacated the convictions of the West Memphis Three. Then each pled guilty to the 3 murders while maintaining their innocence, as demanded in an Alford plea. Jason Baldwin would say it took a false confession to put them in prison and another false confession to get them out. And Jason is right. Then the prosecutors began their press conference, with Dan and Leah Ann standing behind Scott Ellington. A reporter asked, quote, "If you think they're guilty, why are you letting them go?" With Ellington stammering, "Well, I hope they have rehabilitated themselves," end quote, as Dan cringed. Unbelievably, Ellington had clearly not been prepared for that question and asked for a statement. Dan Stidham declined. Moving to the defense press conference, Dan was asked to stand with them. Afterwards, he walked Jessie Misskelley to the car where his father was waiting. They would be going back to the same trailer that Jessie had left on June 3rd, 1993. Then Dan overheard John Mark Byers giving a statement, quote, "This is not right, and the people of Arkansas need to stand up and raise hell, because 3 innocent men are going to have to claim today that they are guilty to a crime they didn't know, and that's bullshit. This is wrong what the state of Arkansas is doing to cover their asses, and I'm sick of it," end quote. Hundreds cheered, and he is correct. Dan did not attend any celebratory events that night. He went to his son's 34th birthday party, and he would say that freeing the West Memphis Three was the best birthday gift ever. Well, another documentary, West of Memphis, was released in 2012 by Peter Jackson and his partner Fran Walsh. In this, they sought to give the defendants the trial they never had, with all the new evidence discovered since the original trial. And it is powerful, and I recommend streaming it. It's West of Memphis. June 2014, a single man from Arkansas has expressed remorse concerning the railroading of the West Memphis Three. In an interview for an oral history project, Arkansas Supreme Court Justice Daniel L. Corbin spoke with candor. Quote, "I keep thinking that surely there was something that I could have done. I should have asked more questions, and I'm saddened by it. 3 boys' lives were ruined because of something I had a hand in. I couldn't protect them because I didn't know any better. I judged the case on the evidence that I had at the time, and then I totally changed my position when this new evidence started coming in. But it took 18 years for them to do that. I still feel badly about it, that the state used me to convict kids who didn't do it," end quote. Powerful, and that is one honest man who can admit his errors. And Dan writes, quote, his contrition came far too late to prevent the malevolent harvest of innocence of the best years of their lives of those kids who didn't do it, end quote. Prosecutor John Fogelman ran for and was elected a circuit judge. Dan worked for his opponent. However, time would prove that he was a fair judge, and he played no further role in the West Memphis Three case. He was not a David Burnett or a Brent Davis, who worked to maintain a wrongful conviction even after it was obvious that they were innocent. In August 2008, Fogelman asked for Dan's support as he ran for the Arkansas Supreme Court, and Dan gave it wholeheartedly. Boy, this makes me realize I really need to work on myself. I really have to work on my level of forgiveness because that's a tough one for me to get. Not long after the 2011 Alford Plea, while standing in a courthouse parking lot, Dan ran into Fogelman, shaking his hands as he congratulated Dan. Quote, this would never have happened but for your perseverance. I just wish they would have gotten new trials instead of it happening the way it did, end quote. Dan agreed. He would have preferred new trials as well. So years had passed. Christmas 2020, an issue from the trial continued to irk Dan. The testimony by inmate Michael Carson, who claimed that Jason confessed to him while they were sharing a cell in juvenile detention, one they had actually never shared. Had Davis even bothered to confirm that part of Carson's statement? Well, evidently not. I think we're all aware of the prosecutorial pattern of duplicity in this case. Well, Carson recanted this testimony. He lied to curry favor. Still, Dan reflected back on 1994. Had Brent Davis offered Jason Baldwin a plea deal of just 5 years if he would testify against Damien Echols in his desperation to snare Jason's testimony to bolster a weak case? Dan wondered if this rumor were true, and Dan texted Jason. And Jason responded, quote, you are correct. The first offer was 20. The second offer was down to 5 with an emphasis on jail time credit and good time, meaning go home soon, end quote. And Jason said, no. And I am amazed at the character of Jason Baldwin, who was 17 when this offer came down, and he refused to lie and chose to fight for his freedom and Damien's because they were innocent. Dan and I both admire him greatly. And these were hard, terrible years that included beatings, broken bones, a skull fracture. And Jason emerged from prison a better person. And today he helps others who have been wrongfully accused and convicted. Remaining close with Jason, he and Dan have discussed the Alford Plea a number of times, and Jason has no animosity for anyone over it. You see, at first, Jason rejected the Alford Plea. They had just won an evidentiary hearing. They had a new and reasonable, unbiased judge, the antithesis of Judge Burnett. Jason had faith, and he wanted exoneration in court for all of them. But as terrible as Jason's prison experience was, Damien Echols was on death row and existed in a concrete coffin, not knowing when his last day on earth would be. This had been far worse. And Jessie hadn't had an easy time in prison either. Jessie Sr.'s health had deteriorated, so he hadn't been able to visit his son. And then they learned the Alford Plea was contingent on all 3 men taking it. It was an all or nothing deal. And in the end, Jason's moral compass swung to compassion for Damien and Jessie, and he selflessly decided to accept it as well. This was not in his own best interest, and Dan continues to fight for their exoneration. There were motions pending that would continue to eviscerate the investigation and the evidence presented. Damien Echols' attorney, Dennis Riordan, was very successful, a veteran defense attorney, and he had not been issued a gag order like Jessie and Jason's defense team had. and Riordan had ensured that the press were aware of these unfolding events, which ultimately benefited all three defendants. Damien also had a Rule 37 petition, which was adjudicated, and the original attorneys of Damien and Jason refused to accept any responsibility for their convictions, even when it was woefully clear that there had been serious legal missteps. Ron Lax, furious with Damien's former attorneys, told him, quote, "They seem to be working in concert with Davis's assertions that they were quite effective at trial," end quote. When you contrast this with Dan's honest admission of his failures, I have to conclude that these lawyers would simply not tolerate any dings to their ego and acted at the expense of their former clients. It's hard to accept criticism, but these were innocents put in prison. In 2015, still carrying guilt that he wasn't able to prove in court that the West Memphis Three were innocent, Dan began working on this book, and he stumbled on an article published by the Thomas Jefferson School of Law in San Diego. Damien Echols' new attorney, Stephen Braga, and prosecutor Scott Ellington had come together to forge the Alford Plea. Braga is quoted, "The Alford Plea was the only compromise we could come up with to try to bridge the gap between the state's absolute refusal to drop the charges and the Three's absolute demand to maintain their innocence of crimes they did not commit." End quote. Ellington said that this was an opportunity to put an almost 20-year-old case to rest. And this compromise was less than ideal, a paradise imperfect. But trying the case anew before 36 jurors using the old evidence, failed memories, changed minds, dead witnesses, with two parents who now believe the defendants were innocent, was untenable. Well, that's because they were innocent, Mr. Ellington. A December 2011 GQ article by Sean Flynn reads, quote, "On April 19th, they pled guilty to a murder they did not commit, and a judge sent them home. Their release had nothing to do with right or wrong, with guilt or innocence, and least of all, with who killed those boys. It was an act of legal expedience, a way to let three innocent men out of prison without the bother and embarrassment of actually exonerating them, a seeming paradox, an ugly way out of an uglier situation," end quote. That sums it up really well, and this perspective did help Dan find some peace. Quote, "Truth and justice are sometimes elusive creatures, and prayers to find them often go unchecked for decades. As my pastor once told me, you must have faith," end quote, as the book closes. Now, my 2ndCast research is going to kick in, because there's more. In February 2012, now Senator David Burnett broke his silence on the case, speaking to K8 News. On the Alford Plea that released the men from jail, he said that this was a mistake. Quote, "I'm not real happy with the outcome. I would have preferred to see them have a new trial," end quote. And this pisses me off greatly because he was the obstacle to the new trial. He had the power to grant a new trial, and he denied all their appeals. He is why they spent 18 years in prison. He, Judge Burnett, Senator Burnett. As to his conduct during the trial, Burnett defends it, saying, quote, "Frankly, everything I did was affirmed by the Arkansas Supreme Court," end quote. He accepts no responsibility for this travesty of justice, for abusing his power as judge, saying, quote, "I didn't find them guilty. 2 juries did," end quote. David Burnett was never held accountable for his outrageous behavior and locking up 3 innocent teens while tarnishing the reputation of the Arkansas judicial system. He is a fraud of a man, a failure as a judge, a failure as a jurist. Well, once released from prison on that beautiful sunny day in 2011, Jessie Misskelley, Jason Baldwin, and Damien Echols began a decade on probation. Jessie went home to live with his dad in the same trailer in the same town, and many were deeply concerned that the West Memphis Police Department might do something to provoke Jessie into violating the conditions of his release. Peter Jackson actually offered to buy Jessie a house across the river in Mississippi, but he wanted to go home and be with his dad, which is very understandable, but thankfully, this fear was never realized. Jason Baldwin still wants to clear his name, as he wants to become a lawyer and is barred due to the 3 felony murder convictions, which is still hampering his life. On his Facebook page in 2017, he wrote, quote, "The state's power to murder her people must be taken away. The death penalty heals none and brings closure to none. The state uses it as a tool to terrorize the innocent into taking plea agreements to crimes they never committed. They threatened me with death for a crime I never committed. I was only 16 years old. They told me all I had to do was say, 'Damien did it,' and they would spare my life. I knew they would do their damnedest to murder me, but I stood fast to the truth. I refused their deals and suffered. I will not lie against an innocent to save my own life, but others will, and others have time and time again. Decades later, they threatened me with the death penalty again. They told me they would kill Damien if I did not sign my good name away through the Alford Plea. I knew then the state was serious in its threats, just as serious as they are today. The state does not care about truth or justice or closure, but convictions and what they call finality. So to save Damien's life, I allowed the state to sacrifice my good name, and I signed their devil's deal in the form of the Alford Plea. End state-sanctioned murder, people. It is not just." End quote. Well, Damien Echols went home to his loving wife, Lori Davis, spending years struggling with PTSD after 18 years of abuse, terror, assault, anxiety, stress. He's written a number of successful books and loves cats. In 2022, Echols petitioned Crittenden County requesting more DNA testing of crime scene evidence, still working on their exonerations. This new DNA testing would utilize the MVAC, technically far superior to anything science had in 2007, and it has the potential to identify the actual perpetrator and scientifically prove the innocence of Mr. Echols, Mr. Baldwin, and Mr. Misskelley. This petition was denied because only inmates can request further DNA analysis. Well, in April of 2024, in a 4-3 decision, the Arkansas Supreme Court overturned the lower court, ruling that Damien Echols is entitled to petition an Arkansas court for new DNA testing of the crime scene evidence of the 1993 murders of the 3 boys. Stephen Braga spoke to CNN for Damien. Quote, "I thank the Arkansas Supreme Court for opening the DNA testing door that might finally reveal the truth about this case." End quote. Their next step will be trying to reach an agreement with the prosecutor to get this testing done. So this is not over, and please pray with me that the prosecutor isn't a total ass and will move this forward quickly. And I cannot believe that nearly 2 decades of legal malfeasance could get any worse, but it did. Another huge concern arose regarding the Echols-Baldwin jury. It would be revealed that during deliberations, the jurors discussed Jessie Misskelley's confession, having heard of it via the media. Recall that it had been printed in many newspapers. And remember, Jessie had refused to testify, which made the confession inadmissible for the Baldwin-Echols trial. Still, the jury had used the confession in their deliberations, which violates so many constitutional rights and legal proceedings that it blows my mind This is a, quote, direct breach of judicial command, end quote. During their voir dire, juror number 4, who would become the foreman, denied knowing anything about the Misskelley or the West Memphis Three cases. Now, years later, he admits to knowing that Jessie had confessed to the murders and had been offered a 40-year plea deal, which he refused. During deliberations, juror number 4 had suggested that they organize their discussion of the evidence and its analysis in the T chart, so a large sheet of paper with a pro and con columns. Juror number 4 would say that, quote, the jury could not ignore the Misskelley confession despite the court's instruction to do so. It played a large part in his decision of the case, end quote. Juror number 4 also indicated that the other evidence against Echols and Baldwin was scant. Now, after the trial, juror number 4 never spoke to the press until he was contacted years later by Echols' attorneys. It was discovered juror number 7 had signed a notarized affidavit stating that she had kept the notes that she had taken during the trial, which confirmed the existence of the T chart. Her notes showed that written on the Echols con side was the, quote, Jessie Misskelley test led to arrest, end quote. On the Baldwin chart, con side, third from the bottom, was written, quote, J. Misk State, end quote. Her shorthand for Jessie Misskelley's statement. Other jurors would make similar statements confirming that the jury had, without question, discussed Jessie's confession, which had never been introduced into evidence. Another juror admitted that after being selected for the case, he told his law enforcement father, who began, quote, spitting out details about the case, end quote. This left him utterly terrified that a satanic cult might come after him and kill him, his father equally concerned. Now, I'm skimming the surface of this, but it is painfully obvious that the jury violated the rules of the court spelled out by the Supreme Court in a manner that is extremely prejudicial to the defendants. This alone would have gotten the Echols and Baldwin convictions overturned, well, as long as Judge Burnett wasn't presiding. I have copies of these T-charts on my blog at www.murdershelfbookclub.com, and this is October 24. Now, the remaining problem. Who did kill Christopher Byers, Michael Moore, and Stevie Branch? Todd Moore and John Mark Byers had strong alibis, their timelines confirmed by other witnesses. Moore, a truck driver, was on the road when the boys went missing, and he returned to West Memphis and joined Byers in searching for the boys. Terry Hobbs. Okay, so recall back in the 2007 DNA testing. We know that the DNA of a hair found entwined in the shoelace ligature on Michael Moore matched Stevie Branch's stepfather, Terry Hobbs, and one found in a tree at the crime scene matched his friend, Dave Jacoby, who Hobbs had visited the night the boys vanished. Well, due to this development, on June 21st, 2007, Terry Hobbs was finally interviewed by the West Memphis Police Department. Undisputed, at 5 p.m., Terry drove then-wife Pam to work at Catfish Island. He picked her up at 9 p.m. and told her that Stevie was missing. The 4 hours in between are concerning. Terry has given a few different versions of what he did, searching the neighborhood with daughter Amanda, meeting up with Dana Moore and John Mark Byers before 6 p.m., figuring out their boys were together, which is utterly impossible because John Mark Byers hadn't reported Christopher missing until 8:30 p.m., and Byers also refutes having seen Terry at the time he claimed as well. Terry Hobbs claims that he and friend Dave Jacoby were out looking for Stevie with hundreds of other people between 6 and 6:30 p.m., but the boys were last seen on their bikes at 6 p.m. But I'm happy to go with Hobbs putting himself in Robin Hood Woods at that time, when it's likely that the killer was with the boys. Okay. Dave Jacoby says he got off at work at 4, was home by 4:30 p.m., and was playing guitar. Terry Hobbs came over with daughter Amanda looking for Stevie, who was supposed to be home at 4:30. Amanda began playing with David's daughter, and after 35-40 minutes, Terry went to see if Stevie was home, returning to say he wasn't, and leaving Amanda there, Terry and Dave went out to look, driving around, making slow loops around the neighborhood. Terry would then drop off David Jacoby, and later that night, after he got Pam, they would resume looking for the boys. Now, retired profiler John Douglas believes that this is a personal cause homicide, meaning, quote, an act of interpersonal aggression that results in the death of a person or persons who may or may not be known to the offender and is not motivated by material gain or sex and is not sanctioned by a group, end quote. Instead, it is caused by underlying emotional conflicts that pushes the perpetrator to homicide. And this comes from the crime classification manual that John Douglas has co-authored. It is his contention that this killer knew the victims and the victims knew the killer. This killer is a male adult and a psychopath who never set out to kill anyone, but instead wanted to taunt and punish the kids for a perceived misbehavior, like not getting home by 4:30 as told. He was likely looking for one boy when he noticed the bikes left by a pipe that crosses the channel, leading into Robin Hood Hills. To control them, he made them strip, rendering them vulnerable and reluctant to take off running. Hog-tying the boys left wrist to left ankle, right wrist to right ankle with their shoelaces is something that Douglas has never seen before. But I can envision the killer making the boys sit down and remove their shoelaces, tying them up, with the boys fearful of trying to get up and run away naked. However, this killer went too far after he became enraged, probably because one of the kids mouthed off something like, "You can't tell me what to do, you're not my father." The autopsy indicates that the boys suffered head wounds prior to death, while other wounds in the body were likely from animals occurring post-mortem. Once the head injury occurred, the killer realized he had to kill the boys or his life and livelihood were over. Tied up, they were tossed in the stream, drowning. The victims' clothes were buried underwater, held in place by makeshift stakes, as the killer went off to establish an alibi. Burying the clothes under the water would buy him time. Douglas said, quote, "The subject put sticks in the clothes so the clothes couldn't be seen by the police or investigators, so it was hidden. Do you think these 3 teenagers would have the kind of sense to do that?" End quote. And he added that he'd have, quote, "put Hobbs on the front burner back then," end quote. In 2020, Oxygen produced a special called The Forgotten West Memphis Three with investigative podcaster Bob Ruff. Ruff spoke in depth with retired FBI supervisory agent Jim Clemente, who also created a suspect profile, a lone male in his 30s who is either biologically related to one or more of the victims, a family member, or a very close community member. He was trusted by the boys, which enabled him to get close and control the boys without help. Clemente said, quote, "If some stranger who looked very threatening approached these 3 boys, I think the first reaction of these boys would be to run away to look for help. And there is absolutely no indication that this was the case. So this tells me that this offender was someone they know," end quote. There is also no forensic indicators that more than one offender was involved in this, as everything done to each of the victims was consistent. Clemente painted a scenario very similar to Douglas's, a reprimanding for an infraction gone way overboard, injuring one boy, he had to kill the others who were witnesses. From the way the boys were stripped and tied up, Clemente believes the subject worked with animal carcasses, maybe a butcher or a hunter. Quote, "The ligatures are not restraining ligatures. They seem to me to be more practical ligatures," end quote. Clemente believes the killer likely spent more time concealing the bodies, their clothes, and their bikes after the death than he took to neutralize and kill the boys, desiring not to get caught. If he didn't have a relationship with the victims, he would have skipped this entirely and then left, likely on the interstate roads that were so close by. Scene cleaned up, this killer went off to establish an alibi, needing to change clothes, to get rid of them, or wash what was worn during the murders and the concealment. Now, this isn't the killer's first brush with the law. He's got a record, possibly for violent outbursts and a history of domestic violence, and places a high importance on following rules, obedience, and punishment. Now, moving backwards in time a little bit, tension on Hobbs heated up after 2007, and Terry wound up suing the Dixie Chicks, Natalie Main, for defaming him for slander. So this meant that Terry Hobbs now had to give a deposition under oath, and this provides his recounting of events in May 1993. Asked if he had anything to do with the boys' murders, Terry denied it completely. He also admitted to working as a butcher at one of his father's slaughterhouses back in the 1970s, which does jive with Clemente's profile. Oh, and by the way, Terry Hobbs lost the Natalie Main slander suit, and he was ordered to pay her legal fees of $17,590. Dan doubts he's paid up. Now, Pam Hobbs, now Hicks, had to give a deposition for the Main lawsuit, and she describes her married life with Terry. Quote, Terry was a regular user of drugs. He frequently smoked marijuana in our home and out of the house. He also used crystal methamphetamine and cocaine. Terry was violent, and he hit me twice. Terry and I got into an argument, and I insinuated that Terry had a girlfriend. As I attempted to leave the house, to just drive around and cool off, Terry fought me for the car keys, and when he couldn't get the keys, Terry hit me in the face with a closed fist. I was truly hurt, and I was worried that he had broken my jaw because he hit me so hard. End quote. Subsequently, there was a family fight that night, which resulted in Terry Hobbs twice shooting Pam's brother Jackie, who had to have 10 surgeries as a result. Terry was sentenced to 6 months for aggravated assault, and Jackie would die a decade later from a blood clot related to these surgeries. Pam also stated, quote, that Terry and Stevie did not have a good relationship. Terry would frequently hit the kids with a belt. He would then make them hold up their hands in the air as he whipped them. Sometimes when he whipped Stevie, he would leave belt marks on him, end quote. Terry and Pam's daughter, Amanda, accused Terry of sexually molesting her. In her deposition, she said, quote, then, when I was 15, I started getting, excuse my language, fucked up all the time. Now, I don't remember what happened in my life last year. I used to tell my mom that my dad messed with me. I honestly don't remember. As far as I remember, from 15 until now, my dad has never touched me sexually, but he did beat the hell out of me, end quote. In the West of Memphis documentary, Amanda Hobbs would confirm sexual abuse by her father. However, in May 2024, Amanda Hobbs was interviewed on the Unforbidden Truth podcast, and the link to this interview is on my blog. Amanda confessed to doing drugs while filming the West of Memphis documentary, agreeing to participate for money used to buy more drugs, and she recanted this accusation. Quote, the truth is, my father never molested me. It's absurd, end quote. She apologized for taking this blood money and to her father, having never considered the long-term impact of her accusation on him, and they have mended their relationship. Amanda says she is clean and in her right mind, and that is a definitive statement for me, so I will go no further into this question of Terry Hobbs, because this case is about false accusations, false confession, false conviction, and I do not know who killed those precious little boys. Our amazing author, Dan Stidham, also has a theory he's marinated over the years as well, that these 3 Cub Scouts were actually killed by a serial killer roaming America's highways. This idea came from a meeting Dan had with 2 FBI profilers from the Academy Group, who both felt that the proximity of the scene to the busy interstate and truck stop likely meant that a very mobile serial killer, potentially a long-haul truck driver, was the perpetrator. The crime scene's location was easy to access from the conversion of highways, as I've described to you. Retired FBI agent Frank Figliuzzi recently published Long Haul in May 2024, focusing on the FBI's Special Unit Highway Serial Killings Initiative, and he writes today that there are at least 850 homicides that have been linked to a solitary breed of predators, long-haul truck drivers. So I cannot dispute this is a significant possibility, again, especially with the proximity of the truck stop to the crime scene. But I also see real substance in the supposition that the kids knew the killer, as suggested by both Douglas and Clemente. So on this, I am happy to let my betters try to solve this one, murder bookies. A Harvest of Innocence was published in late 2023 and during the summer of 2024, with thoughts of Stevie, Christopher, and Michael still haunting him. Dan Stidham still carries the emotional and psychological remnants of this case around with him in his heart and mind. And this concludes my trilogy on A Harvest of Innocence, the untold story of the West Memphis Three murder case by Dan Stidham and Tom McCarthy. Once you see, you cannot unsee, and this case greatly disturbs me. And I am praying that the new DNA testing will shine the light of truth on the case, revealing the true killer, who I pray will be prosecuted fairly based on real evidence, science, and facts. I pray for the parents of these poor children and for the souls of Stevie Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore. Just so terribly sad. And murder bookies, our next book is Silent Silhouette: Who Killed Deborah Sue and Why? By George Jared and Jennifer Buchholz. In 1975, Deborah Sue Williamson was a newlywed living in Lubbock, Texas. One night, when her husband was away at work, she was brutally stabbed 17 times in the carport of their home. Many suspects were investigated, including Henry Lee Lucas, but no one was charged, and the case went cold. Enter investigative journalist George Jared, who teamed up with friend and former Army counterintelligence officer and university professor Jennifer Buchholz to study this case and find a killer. Along the way, they created a massive team of citizen detectives that have brought resources to bear on heating up a 50-year-old cold case. This is a remarkable story of perseverance, advocacy, and the relentless demand for justice, and I can't wait to start telling you about it in 2 weeks. Thank you for listening. I see you as you hear me. Please take a few minutes and leave an awesome review that will help me make new murder bookies. Share the podcast with your friends and family, and share your thoughts with me at jill@murdershelfbookclub.com or on X, Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube, or join Patreon for $4 a month. Enjoy the crisp fall weather, pumpkin spice, and the gorgeous leaves changing. See you in 2 weeks. Written and produced by Jill, all rights reserved. Music, The Pewter Elephant by Blue Dot Sessions.